In this video, we're going to recreate iOS 15's notification summary screen with Tailwind CSS. Let's get right into it. I have prepared a single HTML file in VS Code, and as you can see, it's loading Tailwind. And we're using the just-in-time mode, and nothing in the config file is customized. And we also have a completely vanilla CSS file with the 3 Tailwind directives. So we're going to try and build the UI here. And I also have a screen split side by side with the screenshot that we're going to try and build. And our build is going to come here and we can see them side by side to compare. All right, so let's start by building a phone frame to start with. And we're not going here for ultra realistic iPhone, but we're going to make it good enough that it looks like an iPhone. So I'll come down here and we'll have a div with some Tailwind classes. So I'll use a height and width with just-in-time arbitrary values here. So we have the correct aspect ratio of the iPhone, 712 pixels. And for the width, we're going to have 350 pixels. And let's give this a black background for now, BG black. So here's our very rough shape. And now we're going to add rounded corners with rounded. Once again, I'll use an arbitrary value here of 60 pixels. And also let's add a shadow, and I'll go with shadow XL. So if we compare this with the screenshot, you can see that we have roughly the same dimension, border radius, and it's a good start. Okay, next, let's add a wallpaper background image that takes the whole space. So before we do this, I'm going to add a relative class to our phone frame so we can have an absolutely positioned image inside of it. All right, so the source of our image is going to be /iPhone-rainbow.jpg. That's what I have on my phone currently. And we'll go and add some classes, absolute, inset 0, height full, and width full. And finally, we'll also go with object cover, so it uses the whole space available nicely. So as of now, we've broken our phone mockup, but fear not, we're going to add a few classes up here. One of them will be overflow hidden, so the rounded corners come back. And we'll also add a border, and let's use one more arbitrary value here of 14 pixels, and we'll make this border black. One more thing that we could add without going too crazy is a little notch here. So for the notch, I'll add a div here. And this is also going to be absolutely positioned. We're going to go with top 0 and inset x 0. And inside of this, we're going to have another div of height 6, width 40, margin left and right auto, so it's centered. BG black, so that's going to give us a rectangle at the top. And then the key class here is going to be rounded B for rounded bottom. And I think we can go with 3XL, which should work pretty nicely. And we could go and add a little line for the speaker and the camera here, but I think that's good enough. And we should now focus on building the UI inside of our phone. So the first thing we're going to build is these 3 little icons here. And we're going to come after our notch. And just to make sure that all our UI now is visible, because we have these absolutely positioned elements, I'm going to have a wrapper that sets everything to relative here. And so inside of here, we're going to have a container that's going to have 3 little icons at the top right. empty2, mr5, flex, justify end. And finally, we want to space the elements within the container with space x1. And so in here, we're going to have 3 icons. So we're going to go grab some icons from Heroicons. And the first one we want is a bar chart, which should probably do. Yep, this one is perfect. So I'll copy the SVG and I will paste the SVG code here. Next, we're going to grab a Wi-Fi icon. Perfect. Copy that, paste it below. And now Heroicons doesn't have a battery icon, so we could search for it somewhere else. But let's say the user that has this phone is expecting a delivery and they have a notification for this. So we could have a truck icon maybe, which is the notification for that, and paste it as our third SVG. And before I save these 3 icons, I'm going to come here and for the 3 of them in the class attribute, instead of H5 and W5, I'm going to go H4, W4 to make them just a bit smaller, and also text white to make them white. So let's save, and that's looking pretty nice. All right, cool. So let's tackle next this little bar that's underneath here. Let's go a div class, and here the height will be 0.5. It's pretty thin. The width is going to be W10 and BG white. So let's save that. And as you can see, it's positioned here on the left. So let's go with MR7, 7 from the right, and margin left will be auto, which is nice. We're also going to add at the start here a margin top of 1.5. And I think that's going to place it pretty nicely. And cherry on top, let's add rounded as well. Let's check it out. And yeah, I'm really happy with that. All right, let's move on and build the next part, which is going to be this section here. So we need one more icon here. Let's look for lock. And it looks a bit different, but for what we're doing here today, that's perfect. And below our line here, let's create a new div. And this is going to be the container for our 3 next elements. So let's go margin top 2. And this is going to be a flex container again. But this time we're going to go with flex col, so they stack vertically. And because we want them to center align, we're going to go with items center. So inside of that, the first child of this flex container is going to be our icon. Once again, I want to change the size and color. So I'll go with H8 here and text white. And we can give it a save. Let's come down a little bit. Next, let's do the time. So this 9:41. And we could have a discussion about what heading level to use here. But since we're just doing a mockup, I'm just going to use a p tag here. I'm going to add some margin top with 3. We're going to make this text white. The size is going to be text 6XL, fairly big, but it's going to be quite thin. So we're going to go with font. And let's go with 200 extra light. And it will say 9 column 41. So let's save this. So I'm going to duplicate this, change the margin top to only empty 1, and the text size to text LG. Let's change the text from 9:41 to Monday, June 7. And that's probably too thin. So instead of extra light, why don't we go with just light here? And yeah, that looks good to me. All right. So we've done some preparation work, and now comes the exciting piece, this frosted glass multi-layered panel notification summary. So let's get into it. So our notification panel here is transparent somewhat, but the text is still very readable because it has that blur background that makes the text readable. Let's first create a container with some spacing, and I'll go margin top 4, and then MX for margin left and right of 2. And because we're going to end up layering multiple panels on top of each other, I will also add a class of relative. All right, so since we want to see it before we put content in it, I will have a fake height of, let's say, 72. And let's make a white shape with BG white, with rounded corners with rounded 3XL. So here's the start of our shape. And as I mentioned before, the background is transparent. But if I add a transparency here, let's go with 50%. You can see that because we have a quite colorful and bright background, this might make the text a little bit hard to read. And so if we have less transparency, then the text is more readable, but we lose that nice effect where the colors shine through. So let's go back to 50. And here the key class that helps us do what we want is to use a backdrop filter, which is going to make whatever you see through the shape, apply a filter. And we're going to go with a blur filter here. Backdrop, and we can go with blur. And there's different types of blur. So let's go with the smallest blur. So you can see a tiny bit blurry now. And if I go with MD, it gets more blur. And that allows us to reduce the opacity until we find something that works really well. I think here we can go with something like 40 and still have the text that should be fairly readable on top. All right, so let's take care of that first section here, which is going to be a flex container. So first of all, because we want some padding on the entire panel, I'm going to go with P-4. And then inside of it, we're going to have our flex container, and we want to push the items to both sides. So justify between is what we want. And since we have 2 elements on the left, I'm going to have a div container. Let's go with a p tag here, 9:30 a.m. H2, your morning summary. And so let's style these. So this 9:30 is going to be text extra small and font bold. And the H2 is going to be text LG and also font bold. Very nice. And so now we want our circle with the number of notifications here on the right. So after the div, this is going to be the other flex child. Let's use a span here, could be div. And the classes here will be background gray 500. We're going to have a set height and width of 8. Rounded full to make a full circle. And let's go with text white. and the text is going to be 11. And now to make the text perfectly centered, we're also going to make this a flex container with items center and justify center as well. And it's going to lock it right in. Perfect. So the next element we're going to do is this section here. And this is going to be a grid with 2 columns. And this one, we're going to add a little margin top of 2. And it's going to be a grid container with grid calls 2 for 2 columns. And we also have a gap of 2. Now we're going to work on the first column. So I'll have a div that contains all the elements of the first column, an image / surfing.jpg here. And I can add a class of rounded LG. So here I'll have an h3, which says surfing heals the soul, kills the ribs. And I'm well placed to know this. Let's go margin top of 2, text extra small, font bold. And I think we can go with the leading a little bit tighter, so leading tight. And finally, let's have a paragraph. And I'll paste some text here. And the classes for that, empty-1 and text extra small. And before I wonder why there's extra padding here, we have this artificial height of 72 that I can remove. So I'm going to copy this entire chunk of HTML here and make our second column. All right, this is looking pretty good so far. So next we're going to have this separator here, and then this last bit of the notification. So let's find the closing tag of our grid, which is this one. And below that, let's have an HR tag. And the classes for this one are going to be empty-4. And we want the border color to be slightly different. We're going to go with border black, but make it 20% opacity. And below, we're going to use another grid container. So margin top, as always. This time I'm going to go with 3, I think. And this is going to be a grid container. This one will have 3 columns. So grid calls 3. Let's go with gap 1. And because we want this side of the grid and that side of the grid to kind of align at the bottom, here I'm going to add the items end class. Okay, let's jump inside this grid. And our first container is going to span across 2 of the 3 columns. So I'm going to go with the col span 2. Over 2 columns, we're going to have another h3 heading that says more updates. And the classes here are going to be text small and font bold. And then we're going to have a paragraph tag here with some classes as well. Empty 0.5, very subtle. Text extra small. And so here the updates are day 1, Reddit, Amazon. And we're going to go with something a little bit more of the current times. So here I'm going to go with polywork, which I'm sure you've heard of. And then Keystone 6, which was just announced. And Sarah Drasner, who just announced a book on engineering management. And so now we have 3 icons, avatars, thingies here. And you can see they slightly overlap and they're aligned to the right. So I'll come out of my col span 2. And this is going to be our last column, col span 1, but that's the default, so no need to specify that. And let's go with an unordered list here. So the classes will be flex. It's a flex container. And let's go with just that for now. We're going to add some classes later. We're going to have 3 list items, and each of these is going to have an image tag, and we'll add also classes to these 3 images. So width and height of 8, object cover to crop them properly, and rounded extra large. I will leave the alt tag empty here. And so the first image is going to be keystone.jpg. The second is going to be polywork.jpg and Sarah Drasner.jpg. All right, so you can see that they align at the bottom of our grid container like we wanted, but they're not overlapping. And to achieve this overlapping, we're going to use a space X, space between utility, but with a negative value. So I'll come up here in the flex container and I'll go minus space X and we'll go with 4 here. And so now there are 2 problems. If I look at here, the one on the left is on top and then they stack behind. And also we want them to be right aligned. So we can fix this by making our flex direction, flex row reverse. But as you can see, we've messed up the space between utility. And when you use space X utilities with a flex row reverse, there is a nice utility just for that, space X reverse. And so now this works perfectly. All right, so that's starting to look really good. The next thing we're going to do is probably one of the coolest features of this whole video, and it's the little stacking of the panels. And we can achieve this exact effect with a combination of scale transforms, opacity, and positioning offset. So we're going to come right at the top of our frosted glass panel here. And remember, I've added the class relative here because now we're going to have absolutely positioned elements. All right, so let's try this out. We're going to have up here a div with a position of absolute. We're going to position it to the bottom of our panel and slightly below. So I'm going to go with minus bottom 2, inset X of 0, and a height of full. And then let's copy the background color, the blur, and the rounded corners here. And I'll paste them after that. So let's give it a save. So if I zoom in here, you can see that it's taking shape, but we want to add that little offset and maybe a little shadow as well. So up here, we're going to add a scale transform, 95%, and we want the origin for that transform to be at the bottom. And let's reduce the opacity because it should fade a little bit out. So maybe instead of 40, we go with 30. I'll come to this div, which is the actual panel with the content in it, and add a shadow class, which is going to be cast over the next panel underneath. So let's take a look now. And maybe we can go with shadow small. So yeah, now it's starting to look pretty nice. And let's do one more of those. So the one I just created here, I'll duplicate. And this one's going to be bottom 4. So a little bit lower. And the scale is going to change. We probably want something like 85. And 85 is not one of the default values. So we could add this in the config. Or we can use an arbitrary value of 0.85. And for the opacity, instead of 30, we're going to go all the way down to 10. And one more thing, like we did before, we're going to come to the next panel and add a shadow small to create that separation between the second and third panel this time. So look at this. I think it looks pretty nice. We could argue that the rounded corners are a bit smaller on the last element. And so on this one, we could go rounded to XL. All right, so we got one more section to build quickly. The bottom controls here. So we got a camera and a flashlight buttons, as well as this little bar here, which represents the slide-in menu. Absolute, bottom 0, inset X 0, and give that element a height of H20. Inside of that, we're going to have a flex container. And here I want to push both elements to the outside. So I'm going to go with justify between. And we're also going to add some padding horizontal with px 10. And inside this flex container, we're going to have our 2 buttons. And for those, we're going to go grab some more icons. So the first one we want is the flashlight. So if we search for light, then we're going to use this one. I'm going to search for camera, and this looks just perfect. So like I've done before, let me change the classes for both these icons. We're going to make them H6W6 and text white. And here are our 2 little icons. So let's come up to the first button here and add some classes. And we're going to go with background gray 800, which is pretty dark, but only at 40% opacity. We're going to go with rounded full to make it circle and add some padding with P-2. So you can see that the color looks right, but if I make the padding a bit bigger to make this button go over this background line here, so let's go P-8. Depending on the background we have, that might clash with the visibility of the icon. So this is why here we're also going to add a backdrop filter, backdrop blur, and we go with medium. And now we still somehow see through the icon background, but it's not putting the visibility of the icon at risk. So let's go back to padding 2. And I'm going to copy this button here with all the classes. And we're going to replace the second button with the exact same classes. Boom. All right, this is looking pretty good now. Here are the 2 buttons. We're going to finally add the bottom bar here. So here we're going to have a div, and we want this element to also be absolutely positioned. We want it to be almost at the bottom, but not quite. So I'll go with bottom 1. We'll have inset X 0. And then inside of there, we're going to have another div. And this one is going to be placed in the center with MX Auto. It's going to have a height of 1 and a width of 28, a background of white, and give it some subtle rounded corners with rounded. You can see the bar right here, and I think it looks pretty good. And that about wraps it up for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye for now.